I woke up with the bitter taste of emotional poison in my mouth, as if the world had warned me too late that there was something rotten in the air, and as my eyes struggled to focus, I felt the strange weight on my body, that slowness that does not belong to natural sleep but to something imposed, planned, calculated. I wasn't just any man. I was the CEO of an offshore company, a man who built an empire with discipline, sleepless nights and decisions that many wouldn't have the courage to make. And yet, there I was, doped inside my own house, as if my life had become a scene from a movie, where the protagonist discovers that trust is the weapon that cuts the most. I felt his tongue heavy, his slow pulse, and that silence that denounces that danger has already passed through the door and is now sitting in the living room, waiting for the right time to act. When I tried to get up, I saw her shadow at the door, my wife, the woman I had loved with devotion, holding a glass of juice with fake ice out of worry, and next to her, the brothers, with that tense manner of someone who tries to look casual, but carries guilt in her eyes and greed in her teeth. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I would wake up confused, obedient, fragile. But the body may be slow, the mind may not. I saw the glances exchanged, the nervous hands, the disguised haste, and in that instant I understood that the loyalty I offered was used as a handcuff against me, and what they wanted was not just my name. It was my future, my heritage, my entire story put on a platter. I breathed slowly, feigned weakness, let them believe they had won. The worst punishment for underestimating someone is to see their own illusion crumble, and I let that illusion grow in their minds like poisonous grass. I heard my wife say that I needed to sign some simple papers, almost whispering as if I feared waking up the conscience that she thought was destroyed, and I saw one of the brothers discreetly place a briefcase on the table, looking at me with that dry smile of someone who awaits the final blow. I didn't move a muscle that they couldn't interpret as defeat. Inside, however, a fire ignited. Every second was a file for my memory. Their every gesture was a wordless confession, and as they leaned in, believing I was in control, I only thought about what I would do when I regained my balance. There would be no screaming. There would be no despair. There would be method, calculated coldness, justice served with surgical elegance. When I returned to the room, I dropped my heavy body on the bed on purpose, and as soon as the door closed, I slid my hand into the hidden compartment on the side, where I keep a discreet recorder. I called without hesitation. I didn't invent feelings, I invented facts. Their voices echoed through the house nervously, coordinating the next stage, discussing schedules, signatures, false witnesses. I just registered it. Every word was legal gold. Every sentence was their undoing becoming inevitable. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. Those who have survived the real risk of the corporate world learn not to tremble in front of the small domestic theater. What they tried to do to me was not just a crime, it was pure ingratitude dressed up in ambition. They didn't just want money, they wanted to erase my value to wear my place. When the effect began to wear off, I walked to my internal office, that room that no one enters without my consent. I took my reserved phone, not the usual one, but the one I only use in real emergencies, and made 3 silent calls. My lawyer, my digital expert, and my confidential security consultant. The operation had begun, and this time the centerpiece was the truth, and it always wins when you have evidence. While my enemies slept with the false sense of victory, I organized copies, uploads, encrypted backups. Their house was a theater. The world, however, was my stage. I didn't need to confront them yet. First, I would let the law breathe, let the evidence take shape, let justice wake up before the sun. And by the time dawn came, I had it all. Every message exchange, every attempt to clean up files, every nervous sigh from them registered as a silent witness to their own ambition. The tables had turned there as they smiled, believing they had knocked me down. The truth is that I didn't fall. I watched, endured, and got up the very second I realized that their blow was too small for the size of my intelligence and coldness. They chose the poison, I chose the strategy. They doped me, I woke up. They wanted to destroy me in silence. I would knock them down so that the whole world would hear the crash. When I asked myself to calm down, it wasn't a gesture of weakness. It was a strategic decision. That day, after the house slept, believing it had closed in, I didn't wait for the sun to rise. I stood up carefully, as if not wanting to set off an invisible alarm, and went straight to the safe where I keep the company's vital documentation, Original contracts, digital signatures, authentication keys, and physical copies of everything that could be used to prove my ownership and protocols. Not out of pride, but out of necessity. Betrayal had shown me that trust needs redundancy. My safety should be proof against other people's hands. While collecting papers and transferring secure copies to isolated devices, I left a short coded message for my lawyer, one of those that do not disappear willingly. Activate Alpha Protocol. Evidence on the secure server. Emergency meeting at noon. The executive's life is made up of decisions that seem small to those who are not in the center, and this was one that would determine the entire outcome. The first expert I hired was technical. I called in a digital forensics expert I've known for years, one of those who aren't impressed by drama, only metadata. I handed him the USB stick I found, the footage I had recorded myself with the device hidden, and their cords of the home router. I asked him not only to analyze but to put together a chronological report with every change, every access, and every attempt at cover-up listed in order. As he worked, I gathered parallel evidence, text messages, bank records that showed suspicious transfers, emails with matching times, and most importantly, images that demonstrated coordination between my wife and siblings. I knew that the strength of my answer would come from the impeccability of the evidence. Legally, emotions matter little. What counts is the chain of evidence that unites intention to act, and I was building an unbreakable chain. In the middle of this cold operation, I faced one of the most uncomfortable moments, talking to my mother. She knew nothing. He was the last person I wanted to get involved. But I needed an impartial witness who knew my history, my integrity, and could, if necessary, testify about my behavior and habits that would prove that I would never fail to check important documents. I explained the basics, without crude details, and invited her to be present on the day I was to present the evidence to the board. Silently, she understood and promised to be there. Having a familiar and respected face in the audience was not vanity. It was part of a strategy to neutralize narratives that might try to paint me as unstable or vindictive. Manipulation often arms itself with emotionally compelling accounts. I wanted to balance this balance with presence and calmness. My next step was to design the public call, that moment when the mask fell without a spectacle, only with the clarity of the facts. I arranged with the company's board for an extraordinary meeting, formal, recorded, and communicated in writing to all members, under the guise of dealing with urgent operational adjustments. It was not just a pretext, it was the perfect stage. I also invited my lawyer to be physically present and asked the expert to have a preliminary report printed and ready to present. I set up, with the help of my security consultant, a backup of all the evidence on an external server and sent encrypted copies to 2 fiat addresses, one that would only open with my explicit authorization, and another that would be automatically released if something happened to me. These measures seemed excessive for those who do not live with corporate risks, but the betrayal taught me that excess care is always a virtue when dealing with internal greed. As the minutes went into the meeting, I kept the appearance of calculated normalcy. I'd lunch with my wife as if nothing had happened. I answered emails with the same restrained voice as always. I smiled when a brother tried to make a joke about the tiredness I had shown. They still believed that time had beaten me. They believed that the confusion of the night before had made me vulnerable, and I let them believe. But inside, each smile was a meticulous accounting of the steps that would lead me to expose the truth. There was a dark pleasure in the mathematics of justice, to see logic overcome the chance created by those who tried to manipulate luck. As the time for the meeting approached, I sent a blind carbon copy email to a few key people outside the firm, trusted journalists, associate firm lawyers, and an old colleague from independent auditing. He did not want a public lynching. He wanted transparency that would back up the legal process and prevent rumors from distorting the facts. The exhibition I was looking for was not a spectacle. It was documentation, everything recorded, everything verifiable. It did not seek to destroy lives for pleasure. It sought to prevent others from becoming victims of the same scheme. And if on the way my family failed to save their honor, let it go before a court with all the guarantees of defense, not for justice by my hand, but for justice that society recognizes. The meeting began at the scheduled time, with the cold formality of those who comply with rules and protocol. There were chairs occupied by people who did not imagine the invisible thread that I had already pulled: board members, directors, in-house lawyers, and some executives who only came out of obligation. My wife and siblings arrived with steps that tried to disguise haste and naturalness. Their faces betrayed doubt, and I watched each expression as if reading a complex contract. I kept my voice serene when I opened the session, and on the outside my speech was the usual one, calm, controlled, objective, but inside I knew that the play was already put together. I asked that the minutes be officially recorded and that no one leave until everything was presented. Simple but sufficient requirements to seal the stage. The first time I spoke, it was to thank them for their presence and to remind them that that meeting would deal with operational adjustments. I then invited our digital expert to present a preliminary summary. The report began with technical language, metadata, timestamps, and hashes, words that deep down meant only one thing: proven truth. As the expert unraveled the timeline, I felt the room get heavier. I showed the recordings that I had made myself, the images of the hands that placed the pen drive, the audios where times and doses were arranged. Each excerpt was accompanied by a commentary by the expert, explaining manipulations, edits, and failed attempts to remove evidence. Nothing there was supposition. It was digital tracking and direct connection between intention and act. I saw the paleness increasing on the faces of my traders when I showed messages that proved coordination, conversations in which the moment of the coup was defined, and clear indications that they had tried to create false witnesses to legitimize the transfer. I then asked our lawyer to describe the legal implications and the steps to follow. He spoke with the precision of someone who has dealt with sophisticated fraud, criminal proceedings, precautionary measures, freezing of accounts, and requisition of bank expertise. It was not a spectacle. It was a consequence. At one point, I let the word reach my chest and without raising my tone said something that was more of a closure than an accusation. I compiled evidence. I offered time and opportunity for explanations. There was no plausible explanation. That's why I found this path. That off transparency and the law. That sounded like a sentence to their ears. And the silence that filled the room had the density of something irremediable. The confrontation was not physical. I never wanted it to be. The public humiliation they felt came from the orderly exposure of the evidence, because nothing hurts someone's pride more than seeing their intentions wide open in front of peers, officials, and the press. They tried, in vain, to negotiate, to blame circumstances, to allege manipulations, accusations that sounded fragile in the face of a robust technical report. When one of the brothers tried to speak to justify himself, I showed him a sequence of messages that put him on the same plane of orchestration. When my wife sought defense in emotion, the forensic experts responded with facts. The room witnessed the crumbling of the script that they believed unbeatable. After the presentation, I authorized copies of the report to be forwarded to the competent authority and distracted some points for the independent audit, so that nothing was at the mercy of internal interpretations. As my lawyers filed the briefs, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Relief that I had restored order and rightful property. Emptiness that I knew that ties I thought were unbreakable had been severed. There was also a practical element to address, protecting the company from repercussions, calming customers, ensuring that ongoing contracts were not affected by outside noise. I then asked the communication director to prepare an institutional note, discreet and factual, to inform stakeholders without fueling sensationalism. The priority was to preserve the company, my legacy, and the livelihood of many families. And I made that clear. The hours that followed were intense. Some members of the council called for immediate measures to shield it: password changes, access verification, complete audit of the last 6 months. I authorized everything. At the same time, a trusted journalist, viewers whom I had discreetly warned before, sought the advisory, not to make a show, but to confirm that legal proceedings were underway. The news, when it came to light, had the tone I had planned: factual, without exaggeration, with mention of the process and without sensationalism. Public justice began to act and institutional pressure on the accused grew. Some were removed from their duties on legal recommendation. Others faced protective measures to prevent destruction of evidence. At the end of the day, when the doors closed and the lights in the building dimmed, I walked to my office window and looked out over the city. I thought about the choices that brought me there: shared trust, delegation that got out of hand, and the need for answers that preserved not only my heritage, but order and truth. The vengeance I have done, if I may call it that, has taken the form of law and proper exposure. There was no theatrical revenge, there was restoration. And as the investigation ran, I knew the road would be long. Lawsuits, appeals, nights of doubt, and the inevitable emotional cost of seeing a family fall apart. But I also knew that in silence and with evidence, I'd ensured that their criminal ambition did not prosper. The fourth block begins with the muffled sound of notifications that I no longer had the patience to ignore. Legal protocols being opened, digital copies forwarded, officers requesting documents. In the heart of that dawn that turned day, I realized that the real battle was no longer domestic. It had migrated to rooms where responsibility is decided, and my role became that of guardian of the evidence that would transform intent into proven guilt. As lawyers finalized requests for injunctive relief and police obtained warrants for the seizure of devices, I recalled the nights I made plans and wrote checks thinking about the future I would build. It was absurd and cruel to see those same acts threatened by hands I had nurtured. There was no vocal rematch. There was diligence. The police knocked on the door with military courtesy and dry professionalism. The brothers were forced to hand over cell phones, notebooks, and passwords. To see the faces that yesterday laughed with disdain as they were escorted by agents was a strange sensation, a mixture of technical triumph and human grief, because life does not undo ties by decree. The first arrests did not solve the outbreak of the emotional damage within me. I returned to the office to oversee business continuity and found nervous managers, suppliers questioning deadlines, customers asking for guarantees. My priority, in addition to consolidating legal action, became protecting the company from contagion. I instructed the team to maintain operations with apparent normality, communicated stricter security guidelines, and ordered a full audit of sensitive contracts, strengthened multi-factor authentication, reviewed cash control procedures, and created a compliance area dedicated to monitoring insider risk signals. I learned that prevention needs to be bureaucratic and cumbersome to be effective. That is why I am imposing barriers today that seemed excessive yesterday. While the process was taking its course, the press brought the case to the public with a documentary tone and without derision, because I wanted it that way. There was a moral calculus, to state the facts rigorously to avoid rumors and reduce reputational damage to my company and innocent third parties. In controlled interviews, I repeated only the indispensable, that legal measures were underway and that the priority was operational integrity. I did not seek public lynching, I sought accountability. I saw colleagues who previously criticized me now approach me with discreet questions and requests for guidance. Some offered me support, others watched from a prudent distance. This experience revealed who stayed by the side out of conviction and who stayed by convenience. In the following days, I followed the legal development with clinical eyes. Hearings, complementary expertise, challenges. The defense tried to minimize it, alleged mistakes, tried to contaminate reports with emotional versions. But the chain of evidence built with calm and technique resisted the contestations. Rival lawyers tried to play out narratives of instability, but testimonies, logs, and bank records drew a continuous line of premeditated action on their part. When the precautionary measures became sufficient evidence, some of those involved were formally denounced, and the weight of the accusations became a reality for those who believed that good planning and family ties would be enough to avoid justice. In my heart, I suffered the absence. The house where I once found solace became the territory of burning memories. Ordinary objects now reminded me of betrayals. I then decided to definitively separate the personal from the managerial. I started to live at another address while the investigation was underway, and this, although practical, brought a high emotional price. The loneliness of those who lost trust in those who were close. But with this distance, I found the necessary clarity to reinvest energy in reconstruction. Meetings with specialists, restructuring plans, and above all, personal practices that helped me not to dull my decision-making capacity. The lesson was hard and concrete. Trust cannot exist without mechanisms that verify it. And with that, a new discipline is born in me, of measured concessions, of gentle vigilance, of protection without paranoia. I closed Block 4 knowing that justice was underway and that the process would take time. He also knew that part of the recovery would be administrative and the other intimate. We implemented lasting changes in the company's governance, removed access, created an independent audit committee, and ensured that the story was recorded as an institutional alert. Revenge, when served by the state and the facts, was less cinematic and more effective. It saved the business and established accountability. And in the silence that followed the first court decisions, I found again the ability to plan, now with less naivety and with a coldness that is, curiously, also a form of care. For myself, for my legacy, and for the people whose lives depend on what I protect. When everything was already underway in the legal and operational field, I realized that the last battle was silent and private. It was no longer being fought against them, but within me. The wound of betrayal continued to pulsate even as favorable decisions came out, and I felt it was time to rewrite my life with the same discipline with which Isaved my company. I left the old routine behind, changed my schedules, reorganized my home, and created a new version of myself, less approachable, more discerning, more aware of the boundaries between love and professional trust. I did not seek emotional revenge. I sought dignity. I understood that strength is not only in overthrowing the enemy, but in remaining whole after the fall of illusions. When I finalized the transfer of assets I wanted to protect and completed testamentary adjustments, I finally felt that I had regained control of every part of my existence. The company, which was once the apex of my ambition, has also become the symbol of what I would not allow myself to lose: my effort, my intelligence, my name. I gathered the team, thanked those who stayed, and established a new internal culture, a culture where transparency was not talk but practice. I created smart trust protocols, everything auditable, everything traceable, no room for manipulation and sentimental narration used as a shield for fraud. Some might call this coldness, I call it maturity. After being betrayed by those who slept next to me, I discovered that the most solid protection is not isolation, but discernment. On a personal level, the separation was inevitable, and I conducted it with the same serenity with which I showed evidence in the council. No scandal, no screaming, not theatrical revenge, just facts, only consequences. The judge approved the marital dissolution based on the reports and the ongoing investigation. There was no dispute because there was no plausible defense for what was planned. I left that court not as someone who won, but as someone who survived and learned. The humility to rebuild does not diminish the power of those who have already won battles greater than wounded emotions. Over time, I found balance in the silence that once felt heavy. I started exercising at dawn, went back to my old books on strategy, and rediscovered the pleasure of owning my time. At each step, I reaffirmed to myself that pain did not define me. The answer did. Justice walked, and the law did what I would never allow my emotions to do: punish with method. They faced sentences, lost access, credibility, doors, and privileges, and I followed. More alone, but never again vulnerable to the point of leaving my life in the wrong hands. Today, I look back without regret. I was not cruel. I was fair. I did not seek destruction. I sought protection. And within this process, I discovered that true victory is not seeing the other fall. It is getting up without carrying hatred in your chest. I rebuilt myself with truth, with proofs, with silence, and with the firm conviction that dignity is not begged, it is sustained. That was the greatest revenge, to live without them and to live better, not because I had to prove anything to the world, but because I refused to be a victim of thestry they tried to write for me. I moved on, and in the end, it wasn't about punishing. It was about never allowing anyone else to dictate my fate but me.